Thank you very much. And hello, everyone. Thank you for the introduction. I will try to use the next 20 minutes to introduce the book that was just mentioned to you, as well as to speak about some of what I find are, I think, the most instructive conclusions from this research. For the first few minutes, I will share the screen with you. I hope that everybody can see it. So the book that was mentioned and that I'll talk about today is Anatomy of a Genocide. It came out also in Hebrew and Polish and German and French. Unfortunately, not yet in Ukrainian. I would like to see it out in Ukrainian, but as we know, things are very difficult right now in Ukraine. So there's time to wait for that. And if one wants to have a slightly larger perspective of the region, as well as a more inside look into the kind of personal accounts that are used in writing this book, Voices from War and Genocide that was mentioned right now contains three diaries that give a sort of great three personal views of events in the town of Buczacz in World War I and World War II, and tells, and that book is coming out in paperback very soon, I'm glad to say, and Tales from the Borderlands is coming out in early July, and provides a sort of deeper background of Galicia before the genocide, going back to the 16th century. To get to the point itself, one of the questions that I had when I started writing this book was really, we knew a lot about the Holocaust, so to speak, from the top, that is decision-making, how the genocide was constructed by its architects. But I wanted to know more about what the Holocaust, which was a vast genocide across an entire continent, looked like on the local level, and what sort of encounter there was between the perpetrators and the victims, an encounter that the Germans tried as much as they could to limit, ultimately coming up with the idea of extermination camps. So in order to understand that, I thought that the best way to go about it would be to examine what happened in a single town. And I chose the town of Buczacz, and I'll say a little bit more about it. There were reasons for why I chose Buczacz. Obviously, many of you would know that Shmuel Yosef Agnon came from Buczacz and wrote a great deal about it. He won the Nobel Prize in literature for his writings in 1966. And I read his books when I was growing up in Israel. Immanuel Ringelblum came from there, and he's a very important historian of the writing in the interwar period on Polish-Jewish relations, as well as the founder of the Onek Shabbat or Onek Shabbos archive of the Warsaw Ghetto. And Saul Wiesenthal, the so-called Nazi hunter, also came from Buczacz. But I had a particular personal interest in that town because my mother also came from Buczacz, but she and her parents and two brothers left it in 1935. And so she was not there during the Holocaust. And she told me about growing up in that town many years later when she was 71 years old, shortly before her death. And that conversation with her sparked my own interest in investigating what happened in that town during the war. So just to set this a little bit in context, as you can see, Buczacz was already a town under the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, and it was in the southern part of that vast entity of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, a fortified town that was supposed to be part of a chain of fortifications to hold off Cossack and Tatar invasions from the east and Ottoman invasions from the south. And the 17th century in that region was a particularly bloody one, both because of the Cossack uprising led by Bohdan Khmelnytsky and because of the Ottoman Wars. And in fact, this area was ruled by the Ottomans for the last couple of decades of the 17th century. But in 1772, in the first partition of Poland, Buczacz became part of what the newly named Galicia province of Galicia, Galicia, Galician, under the Austrian Empire, and it found itself on the eastern part of Eastern Galicia, in an area that had a majority of Ukrainian, then called Ruthenian population, a large Polish population, and the largest concentration of Jews in the Austrian Empire. Following World War I, Poland, that had disappeared in the late 18th century, re-emerged as a nation state, but the new Second Polish Republic in its eastern parts again had large minorities. And in the area of Buczacz, again, this was a majority of Ukrainians, a large minority of Poles, and a high representation of Jews, about 10% of the population. So as you understand, this area throughout about 4 centuries contained different populations of different religious denominations. The Ukrainians in that area were Greek Catholic or Uniate, the Poles were Roman Catholic, and the Jews were Jews. And they lived side by side, not always harmoniously, but they really did not know any other kind of existence. This was the only one that they knew. And relations between these two groups started deteriorating really with the rise of nationalism in the second part of the 19th century. Now, at the beginning of World War II, as a result of the agreement between Stalin and Hitler, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, Eastern Poland went to the Soviet Union, and this area of Galicia was now annexed by the Soviets, who deported large numbers of Poles, Jews, and Ukrainians, and arrested large numbers of people, particularly in the latter part of this 2-year occupation, Ukrainian nationalists. When Germany invaded the Soviet Union on the 22nd of June, 1941, this area was taken over by German forces. And in August 1941, District Galician, as the Germans now called it, District Galicia, was annexed to the general government and became part of the occupied Poland that had not been annexed to the Third Reich. So part of the Generalgouvernement of the general government. When the Germans marched in, or even as the Red Army was marching out, and I'm sure that our panelist Kai Struve will speak much more about it, there was a wave of killings. So as the Soviets were leaving, as the NKVD had to abandon the prisons in which it was holding a large number of political prisoners, most of them Ukrainian, they executed thousands of political prisoners. And immediately thereafter, as they left, there was a series of pogroms throughout the region in which Polish nationalists, other hooligans, members of the population, particularly Ukrainians, but not only, carried out pogroms against Jews, killing thousands of them in public killings that were then joined by the Germans as they arrived. The Germans, shortly thereafter, used the Ukrainian militias that had been created by Ukrainian nationalists to assert independence and transformed them into auxiliary police units, which they then employed to carry out their own goal of exterminating the Jewish population of Galicia. Initially, the Germans were quite enthusiastically welcomed because that was seen as the end of a brutal Soviet rule. Later on, of course, the Germans made themselves quite unpopular among much of the population, but of course, certainly among the Jews. The Germans later on also recruited an entire SS division from the population of Galicia, creating the Waffen-SS Division Galicia, Galician in April 1943. What is important to understand what happened in Buczacz is that in a nearby town in Chortkov, the SS established a security police outpost, which was made up basically of 20 officers, mostly German, but also ethnic Germans from Poland, Poland, Lithuania, and Czechoslovakia. These 20 policemen managed within just over a year to murder about 60,000 Jews in that area, including 10,000 Jews in Buczacz itself. When they were not killing Jews, they were having a good time because there was no particular security threat to them. And they had absolute access to whatever they wanted, unlimited access to food, to alcohol, to sex, and of course, total control over life and death. And so they brought their families, their wives, their children, sometimes their parents. This was not only the ZIPO people, the security police people, but other administrators who were there, including the administrators who were in Buczacz itself and were enjoying themselves, even as from their windows they could see the mass killing of the Jewish population. Now, the killing itself obviously could not have been carried out simply by 20 policemen, but rather it was greatly helped by the auxiliary police. There were about 300 Ukrainian policemen in Chortkov, as well as police forces in each town, including in the town of Buczacz. What is important to understand is that once, and I'll go back to that in a moment, once most of the Jewish population in that area was murdered, and Galicia was declared free of Jews in June 1943, Ukrainian nationalist forces, the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists and the Ukrainian Insurgent Army, the OUN-UPA, turned against the Polish population and carried out massive ethnic cleansing of the Polish population in Galicia, especially in 1944, until and even after the Soviet army returned there in July of 1944. Now, to understand a little bit of the nature of this kind of local genocide, if we look at this aerial photo of Buczacz from April 1944, you can understand that everything was extremely intimate. So the killing in Buczacz begins in October of 1942. There is one mass killing already the previous year of about 450 members of the so-called intelligentsia, but the systematic mass killing begins only a year later, in October 1942. And in the first two roundups, or Aktionen, Jews are collected and taken off to the train station and then deported to Buczacz, where they're gassed. That is less than half of the population of the town. Buczacz is closed at the end of 1942, and the rest of the population is killed in situ. It's killed on a hill right next to the town called Federal Hill, and in the Jewish cemetery that's on another hill facing the Federal Hill. And the town is really between these two hills. And there's a series of killings that occur between February 1943 and June 1943, in which the vast majority of the population is killed. Those who survive that, either in hiding or in labor camps, are later on mostly killed before the Soviets finally take over this region in summer 1944. And most of those are killed not by the Germans, but by Ukrainian police units. Altogether, about 7,000 people were killed in this area itself, out of about 10,000 people, Jews of Buczacz, that were murdered by the Germans. I'll stop sharing this now because I want to, one sec, I want to draw some conclusions from this account that I think would be useful in the remaining 5 minutes that I have. So what can we learn from this kind of local study? I'd say, first of all, this is a corrective to the sense, to our understanding of the Holocaust as an event that was carried, as was often argued, in a detached manner, where there was very little encounter between the killers and the killed. On the local level, in hundreds of towns like Buczacz, this was not the case. The genocidal encounter between the killers and their targets was intimate and not detached. It was also not secret. There were many debates over whether the killing of the Jews was secret. The Germans know about it. But in these towns and in hundreds of towns like Buczacz, the killings were public. Everyone could see, everyone could hear, and quite often people would also go to watch the actual killings, climb on trees, or just try to get closer to see what does it actually look like. And when I say people, I mean the rest of the population. Another important finding is that this idea that we have of there being bystanders in genocide, or bystanders to the Holocaust, in the Holocaust. In this case, there was no really, that category did not have much meaning. Everyone participated in one way or another, whether they were sheltering Jews, whether they were denouncing them, whether they were partaking of their property. No one simply stood by and watched. Everyone was part of this kind of social event of local genocide. Another important thing is what I've called in my book ambiguity of goodness, in the sense that most of the Jews who survived because neighbors, people they knew, or people they didn't know, often poor peasants in the surrounding villages, saved them, sheltered them. At the same time, large numbers of Jews who were sheltered were denounced, whether by other neighbors or by the people who were sheltering them. There was also a great deal, even among those who were sheltered, of exploitation for labor or sexual exploitation. And so this notion that we either have altruistic people or people who denounce is complicated by the finding that often people could do more than one thing. They could both shelter and later on, for various reasons, also decide to denounce. I'd say another important thing that we understand is that if we want to understand why local genocide is, what is the reason to study local genocide, we understand that it is not only about the encounter between the victims and the perpetrator, Germans from the outside, but the relation between Jews within Ukraine in this area greatly determined the nature of the local genocide, and it's been much harder for leaders they then allowed to carry out this genocide had not already built of animosity between different groups made or often in collaboration in the end of this. And I see that
Omer,
here that
Omer, it is some problem with the sound, with your sound. We cannot hear you clearly.
Only for the last few sentences.
The last two sentences, we couldn't hear you.
Previously, we heard you just fine. I think until when you said that there isn't any category actually of bystanders and everyone was profiting in some way, and then we couldn't hear you. Sorry.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. Sorry about that.
Okay, I'm muting myself.
Thank you. I'll just end by saying that the last important thing, there are many others, but I'll stop here, is that when you carry out such a local study of genocide, you cannot do it without making a great deal of use of personal testimonies. And although there has been a great deal of debate among Holocaust historians whether we can use testimonies and what is their value in carrying out local research, it's crucial to make use of the large amount of personal accounts, testimonies, and so forth that exist, that have been greatly underused, and to combine them with more traditional sources in order to create a more nuanced and complex picture of what I call local genocide, but one that in fact had to do with about half of the total victims of the Holocaust. And I'll stop here. Thank you.